I'm going to ask how many of you are current PhD students? Raise your hands. So a large fraction. So I'm going to issue a content warning that some of the things I say are going to be blunt truths about possible career paths and career paths that you probably should avoid. So that's the content warning. But I'm going to talk first about my path, and simultaneously to illustrate that it's not transferable necessarily, but also just to show you what I went through to get where I am today. Then I'm going to go into the stuff that's more of a reality check on what the job market looks like, but also some hopeful news that there is life beyond a PhD. So, we'll work this thing. So, I started way back when at University of Waterloo in the mid-70s. So you can do quick arithmetic and figure out how old I am. Graduated with a Bachelor of Science in Chemistry and Physics in 1976. And then went down the road to Toronto, where in 4 years I got a PhD. So that's the first thing. I did get a PhD within 4 years, which is becoming increasingly rare nowadays, even in sciences. And then I went off to Berkeley for a postdoc. Now, a couple of things here that you should recognize. My advisor at Toronto won a Nobel Prize in 1986. He shared that Nobel Prize with my advisor at Berkeley. So that's thing number one to remember in terms of my lucky path, because my path has been very lucky. I want to emphasize that. It's you know, you get to where you get to through a mixture of skill and luck, with luck being perhaps sometimes more weighted. So I, as a graduate student, had something called an NRC Science Award Scholarship, and this was something that was awarded to 75 people across Canada in natural sciences and engineering. So I started off life with, in a sense, a silver spoon. I went to Berkeley on something called the NATO. It was kind of strange. It was called the NATO Postdoctoral Fellowship, and it was actually an NSERC Postdoctoral Fellowship, because NSERC had been created in between when I started graduate school and when I got my PhD. The important thing, and again, here's luck again, the important thing is something called the University Research Fellows Program was created in 1980 by NSERC. And the reason for that is shown in the graph on the right-hand side of the screen, which shows that as bad as things are now for finding academic jobs, they were a lot worse in 1980. If you notice, I'll walk over here. This curve and this curve, this is 30 to 39-year-olds. This is 29 and under, assistant professors. You see the trend. Jobs used to get posted on the University of Toronto. I was in the chemistry building, and jobs were posted one at a time for all fields of chemistry across all universities in North America. So there might be half a dozen jobs on the bulletin board at any moment in time. There were no jobs. The government recognized this, and in 1980 actually cared about it, and so they created this University Research Fellows Program, which essentially paid a large fraction of your salary for the first 5 years of your academic appointment. And so, even though there was no hiring, I mean, when I joined University of Waterloo in 1982 as an assistant professor supported by the University Research Fellows Program, the last person to have been hired in either chemistry or physics at University of Waterloo in a tenure track position had been hired 10 years previously. So this was not a good situation. I was lucky. I'd done a research project, my honors thesis, with a powerful professor at University of Waterloo. He got in touch with me when I was in Berkeley and said, you should apply for one of these. I was interviewing for jobs in the United States, and that's the other thing I found out, is that although I was very proud to be a University of Toronto graduate and a Berkeley postdoctoral fellow, that Berkeley PhDs counted for a lot more on the American job market than University of Toronto PhDs and Berkeley postdoctoral fellowships. Because I was always, no matter which university I interviewed at, I was generally shortlisted with at least 2 or 3 Berkeley PhDs who ultimately got the job instead of me. Now, I was interviewing at top universities, so don't feel too sorry for me. But I got a university research fellowship, which, by the way, was not a tenure-track job. That was just a 5-year fellowship. I managed to land a tenure-track job. 2 of my colleagues, there were 4 of us hired at the same time, roughly, well, in 1981 and 1982. All 4 of us did end up in tenure-track assistant professorships, but 2 had to leave, 1 for University of New Brunswick and 1 for Dalhousie. All 4 had successful careers. 2 of us landed jobs at Waterloo when they became available. So this was how I got my first job. And so good luck, and also, you know, having the good luck to pick the right advisors. And also have a PhD project that actually worked within 4 years. So I continued on at University of Waterloo, University Research Fellow. As I told you, it wasn't a guaranteed pathway to a job, but it turns out that most of the people who landed these things ended up in tenure-track positions somewhere, not necessarily at the university where they got a University Research Fellow. I don't know if the program still exists. It morphed into I think it was called at one point a Women's Research Fellowship, and then it became called something else, because it was for both female academics and Indigenous academics. So when I got the program, it was for anybody. But I think the program may still exist. I don't know if it does. I was promoted in 1988, tenured, took a sabbatical immediately, and by the way, any of you who do end up in a faculty position, don't miss a full year sabbatical. Don't stay on the same campus where you are. I went to France for a year, it was wonderful. Came back, got promoted to full fellow, got promoted to full professorship in '91, had a Sloan Fellowship, and then I continued doing my research. Okay? And, you know, won awards for my research, things like that. Then it became my turn to become chemistry department chair. And that was, you know, it was a rotating position, everybody had to take their turn, it was my turn. I'd managed to dodge it in 3 years earlier, because I had a Canada Council Killam Fellowship, which relieved me of all academic duties. It was pure research for 2 years. So I was able to tell the dean that I couldn't become chair of chemistry because I was being paid not to be chair of chemistry. My turn came up, and so I started as chair of chemistry. Then I was recruited as the head of chemistry. UBC has a head system, even though it's kind of the same thing as being a chair. So I was recruited as the head of chemistry at UBC. So in very early 2001, I moved to UBC with an appointment both in chemistry department and physics and astronomy, but my main job was head of chemistry department. And then things happened. I became Dean of Science, I became VP Research, then VP Research and International. And so it was essentially, I was moving up the corporate ladder, so to speak, getting further and further away from my lab and from being a professor. And so I came to a point, you know, in the teens, that it was obvious that it would not be a good choice for me to go back to being a professor. And so I was coming to the end of my term. I had a countdown on my blackboard. There was a bit of turmoil at UBC with regard to a president leaving early. And so I agreed to stay on for an extra year. And so my 11th year now as VP Research, and really, really did not want to go back to being a professor. So I left UBC to go to, initially on leave, but then more or less permanently. I left UBC in June of 2016, and I was recruited for this job to become Vice President of CFAL. So the last time I actually applied for a job was to become an assistant professor. Since then I was actually recruited. Again, I was lucky. And then finally got recruited to MyTax 4 weeks before the pandemic started. That's referred to in the introduction. And that's where I've been since. So essentially, I left the professoriate 7 years ago. And I left because I knew that I was no longer really a professor. I'd seen too many semi-retired professors who were tenured and they were kind of hanging around, occupying space, doing what they'd done for the last 20 years. I was not interested in doing that. And so it turns out that my lab was given over. I'd hired somebody as a research associate when I became Dean of Science, Valerie Milner. He progressed through the ranks, and by the time I left UBC, he was a tenured professor of physics and astronomy. I just gave the lab to him. It was his lab anyways, because I was such a part-time researcher at that point. And so my lab ended up in good hands, and I left UBC, and haven't regretted it since. So that's my story. I think the things to note are that I was set up on a career path. I did have privilege, and so I progressed through to where I am now. I'm also very happy that I left the university and pursued other career paths. Okay, it's been very interesting working at CFAR. It's been very interesting working at MyTax. Okay. I've also learned that academic leadership is a little different from, MyTax basically functions as a corporation. It's a not-for-profit corporation. And so leadership in a corporation is quite different than leadership in the academy, because there's no such thing as leadership in the academy. All right? Professors all are independent contractors who happen to be located at a university, and they don't really regard themselves as having a boss per se. Okay? Sorry to say that, but that's the way I felt when I was a professor anyways. I'm a boss. And so, you know, there's a big difference between the way things work outside the university and the way things work inside the university, which is not bad, it's just different. Okay, enough about me, because what I want to talk about is you. And so, what do you do with a PhD? And I think there was a great report. I used to be involved with the Council of Canadian Academies, and in 2021 they published a report, Degrees of Success, I think is the actual title. But it's a report on PhD employment. What do people do with a PhD? And I encourage you all to look for it. It's the Council of Canadian Academies, Degrees of Success. Lots of statistics, and a lot of the statistics I'll give in this talk are from that report, but they're also from a report that University of Toronto Faculty of Graduate Studies did about the same time, a little bit before. I think it's a 2019 report called 10,000 PhDs, where they actually did a LinkedIn study of where their PhDs ended up. That's also interesting. Stats Canada has numbers. There's loads of sources of data on what people do with PhDs. In the top, in red, is where many people end up immediately after a PhD, and that's a temporary position at a post-secondary institution. Where people want to end up is the bottom of the red curve, and that's a permanent position in the higher education, at a higher education institution, typically a research university, PhD granting university. That's where PhD students, where most PhD students hope to end up, where they may think they're going to end up. Where they don't want to end up is where I've crossed out at the bottom, unemployed. And the good news is, very few PhD students are unemployed. Very few PhD students, PhD graduates drive taxis. All of that is a bit of social mythology. But what PhD students don't think about is all of the things around the rest of the circle. Working in government, working for industry, working for not-for-profits, working in research administration. There are loads of things you can do with a PhD that don't carry the professor title. The census data from 2016 says that 35% of PhD graduates, and these numbers are almost certainly still valid, 35% of PhDs are professors or lecturers, and the important is or lecturers. So anybody who's a contract lecturer, a sessional lecturer, gets lumped into this 35%. The figure is lower in STEM, higher in business, humanities, arts, etc., social sciences, okay? Especially in humanities. Many of these people are in temporary positions. In fact, and here the statistics get a little bit vague and fuzzy because Stats Canada doesn't really collect these statistics, so you have to look at what universities say, Council of Ontario universities, people like that. But maybe as many as half of these people are in temporary positions at universities. Okay? So you have to discount the 35% of PhDs are professors. They're professors or lecturers. So that's the first important thing. Faculty jobs are in short supply. Okay, there was a bit of a hiring boom, but not too much of a hiring boom. The number of assistant professors has basically remained more or less constant. And so yes, there is a replacement of assistant professors, okay? But the numbers are relatively small. The number of PhD students has gone up quite a lot in the last couple of decades. So these are numbers from 2000 until 2018. Okay, so the first 2 decades of the century. There are 7,700 PhD grads per year, about 60,000 total enrolled in Canadian universities. Looking at the number on this graph, something like 1,400 people are hired every year into tenure track assistant professor positions. These are all tenure track positions on the graph, all right? And so that means, you know, you can do the arithmetic. 6,300 are not hired into assistant professorships. So where do they go? When you look at the other statistics about how many are in educational institutions, again, that's full-time, part-time, contract lecturers versus tenure track. It also includes high schools, colleges, polytechnics. So that's total, you know, Stats Canada doesn't distinguish between, in these stats, it doesn't distinguish between different types of educational institutions, which is why such a high fraction of bachelor students, for instance, and master students work in educational institutions. All right? So, as it was in 1982 when I was looking for a job, jobs are in short supply if you want to become a professor. The good news is, jobs are not as in short supply as they were in 1982 when I was looking for a professorship. Okay? But the general rule is that not many of you in this room are going to become professors. That's just a plain fact, all right? So this is my editorial comment that I apologize for. What should you not do? You should not become a permanent sessional lecturer. That's what my brother-in-law did. He bounced from university, he had a PhD in English from UBC, so good solid PhD. He wasn't that hardworking, so you know, that's life. But he bounced from place to place to place, always on term contracts. Don't do that. The pay is lousy, the work is hard. It's okay to do this on a transition basis, but really, there are better jobs out there than being a sessional lecturer. I quote the numbers, 2016 survey, this is the Council of Ontario Universities, I believe. 45% of sessional lecturers made less than $20,000 per year. Okay. Our minimum salary at Mitacs is $50,000 per year. You can't make less than $50,000 a year if you're working at Mitacs. Okay. So making less than $20,000 a year with a PhD doesn't make any sense to me. Unless, you know, there's family reasons, there's temporary reasons for you to be doing this, I accept that. The difficulty is that of the people who are sessional lecturers, 3/4 of them really want to be full-time faculty. Of course they do. That's why they're putting up with being sessional lecturers. And only 40%, this is the statistic that floored me, only 40% would leave academia to have secure work in another field. I mean, that just makes no sense to me. Why would you not take a job that's secure and is interesting and pays you more money by a factor of 4 to 5 than the job you currently have? Okay. So other than transition, please don't do it. Long-term postdocs, another pays a bit better than being a sessional lecturer, but postdoc is a prerequisite for most faculty jobs, especially in my field in science. You're expected to do a postdoc. Okay. However, the goal of a postdoc is to broaden your research experience, to collect more contacts, publish more papers, so you can get an academic job. The goal of a postdoc is not to be a postdoc for a long, long time. So again, both sessional lecturers, contract lecturers, and postdocs should be viewed as transition, temporary things. All right? Why would people stay in these jobs? Because they think that you get a PhD so you can become a professor. Because that's what the professors want you to do. Right? When I was a professor, of course I wanted all my students to go on to be professors. That was sort of a badge of success. If somebody landed a job at a PhD granting institution, that was success. I didn't know anything about what went on in industry, so I couldn't coach students into getting industry jobs. I couldn't coach students about getting government jobs or about working in the not-for-profit sector. I knew how to be a professor. And so other career choices are, hopefully, they're simply neglected, but maybe they're also discouraged. Like if you don't get a job as a professor, somehow you haven't lived your best life. And that's a sad thing for anybody to tell you. It's a sad thing for any of you to believe. Okay? So, I'm here to tell you, because I've worked with these people, there are many great careers outside of the academic walls. And you should be thinking about them. All of you should be thinking about them, even if you think you're going to become a professor. So, my tax, we have about 400 staff members across the country. We've got about 100 business development advisors, and about half of them have PhDs. Their average salary is $90,000 to $100,000 a year. Interesting work, highly paid, and a lot of them are basically, it's not like they're 50 years old. These are typically young people. A lot of our other people, we have research officers also with PhDs, so my tax, as a not-for-profit, employs a lot of PhDs. When I was at CFAR, I worked with very talented research directors who had PhDs in science, social science. I don't think anybody had a PhD in humanities. But science and social science, certainly. One of them, who had a PhD actually in biochemistry, is now in charge of the Weston. She's the executive director of the Weston Foundation. A very interesting job. Okay, none of them had ever worked in academia. They made the career choice to leave academia and do something equally interesting, but not professorship. The assistant deputy minister who funds us at my tax has a PhD in theoretical physics. So Nippon Vats has a PhD in theoretical physics from the University of Waterloo. Loads of government people have PhDs. All sorts of industry people, not enough, as I'll show, but all sorts of industry people have PhDs. Research organizations, okay, Heart and Stroke Foundation. So there are plenty of ways of getting a job where you will feel valued and you will use the knowledge that you gain in your PhD. Like my former colleague who's now in charge of Weston Foundation, no, she's not a biochemist, but she's doing something really interesting and actually really meaningful and important. So now I'll give the sales pitch because I'm representing my tax. So this is what we do at my tax. We help people prepare for jobs outside of academia. Now, people we work with also get jobs inside academia because we're a research support organization. So, what are we? I represent an organization that has about our current federal contracts over 5 years are $750 million. So we get a lot of money from the federal government. We get a lot of money, about half that amount of money from provincial governments across the country. So we're a large organization. We do about 20,000 internships per year. So last year we did over 20,000. This year we'll probably get about 20,000. Economy's slowed down a bit. We're a membership organization where 70 universities, 84 universities, Carolyn, Senior Director of Academic Partnerships here. Universities are our members. We're not-for-profit. Universities are our members. Okay? However, we work with all post-secondary institutions, 192 post-secondary institutions across the country. We're everywhere. Okay? We work internationally. 15% of our activity is international student mobility, researcher and student mobility. So we have agreements with 25 countries. We have agreements with similar but different organizations within the Canadian innovation ecosystem. And we work with mostly industry, but not exclusively. We work with industry, not-for-profits, municipalities, hospitals, and 8,000 partner organizations we work with. Okay? So, what do? Well, this is from our strategic plan. We're in business to empower Canadian innovation. We do it through partnerships, and we do it through internships. And so what we do is we create partnerships and support partnerships between academic researchers and non-academic partners, typically industry. The way those partnerships work is a PhD student, and most of our work is with PhD students, postdoctoral fellows, and also master's students. The academic research group and industry. And we require them to spend at least a quarter of their time in industry. So it's not the typical industry research contract where the students don't leave their university lab. They just work on an industry problem that industry cares about and is willing to pay for. Industry pays for our internships as well. They pay half the cost, but we require them to have a supervisor in industry who's going to take care of the student half the time. All right? So the students get valuable research experience. They get paid pretty well. So they get paid better than a lot of the NSERC scholarships paid. And of course it contributes to their thesis, but they gain industrial experience and industrial contacts, or not-for-profit, government, whatever. Okay, we have a lot of work that we do with municipalities, for example. So how do we do this? Well, that's where our business development people come in. They're the ones who sort of create these partnerships and make sure that everybody understands what's on offer. I show the quote there. We've actually had more than 10,000 international students and researchers that we've supported as well. We bring a lot of students to Canada through our Global Link Research internships, and we also have Global Link Research Awards that send graduate students out of Canada and into Canada to work on joint research projects. Most of the work we do, though, is with these industry-facing internships. And so, here's another number. It's 11,000 now, so the numbers keep changing, but they keep going up. But basically, we create a partnership. The students get support for as long as it takes. So when I say internship, I mean a 4-month work period. If you're a PhD student, you'll typically do many, many of these in a row to support your PhD research. So we support students over a long-term project as well. We sign contracts for 4- and 5-year projects with industry partners. The collaboration model is, because industry or non-academic partners are paying half the cost, we have to be solving their problem. It's not the typical transfer thing where the professor has a brilliant idea and then hopes that somebody outside the university is interested in it. That's the game that I used to play. It's actually the non-academic partner has a problem they need academic talent to solve, and the students are the vehicle for solving that problem. Okay? We believe very strongly, and I'll show stats to back up why we think this is necessary. Canada needs more innovation, not just in industry. We need healthcare innovation. We've got a contract with Nova Scotia Health to actually put industrial engineers into Nova Scotia Health to optimize their processes, to create efficiencies in healthcare in Nova Scotia. So we have a very large contract with Nova Scotia Health to do that. We're using industrial engineering students from Dalhousie for that project. So healthcare needs innovation, everybody knows that. Not-for-profits and cities absolutely need innovation, and of course industry needs innovation. And so this is from surveys, because we do survey all of our students and our non-academic partners and the professors at the end of the project. 97% of our interns report increased professional skills. And what we found in surveying the students is they don't even know what professional skills they may need to work in industry. Well, this is one way of finding out. And so essentially 100% of them say, okay, I learned the skills that I need for a non-academic job. For those of you in the audience who are international students, we're very proud of this figure. 1/3 more, of our interns, they're 35% more likely to be in Canada for the first job if they do one of our internships than if they don't. And we do that field normalized, and we compare engineering students with engineering students, social science students with social science students. So we retain students in Canada. large fraction of the graduate student population, particularly at the PhD level, are international students in Canada. In technical fields, in some technical fields, more than half of the students are international students. It's a waste to Canada to not try and keep them in Canada. One way to keep them in Canada is to give them the Canadian experience they need to get a Canadian job, to give them the connections they need to get a Canadian job. And we have success on that. It turns out that 15% of our interns actually start their own company. As a result of gaining the industrial experience, they decide that, you know, actually I'd like to run my own company. 15% of them do establish, that's 15% are retained by the partner company, but 15% also start their own company. 17% is the exact number. Okay, that's a national figure. So the students get jobs. Our retention rate of all students in Canada is very, very good. And the retention in their own field is also very good. Okay? And of course, we care about the companies as well, because of course our mandate from the federal government is to increase prosperity and social well-being in Canada. That's why they give us money. They give us money, of course, to provide work-integrated learning opportunities. But what the government really cares about is a more prosperous and healthier Canada. And that's one of the things we contribute to. So you can see, again, this is from survey results. The industry success is also good for the companies we work with. That may not be very convincing because it's survey results. So let me actually hop forward and then come back. We actually did a study where we compared Stats Canada tax data for our companies and for similar companies, a control group of companies. And you can see that our companies were 9% greater employment increase than the control group, 11% greater labor productivity than the control group, and 14%, this is the figure that should really appeal to you, 14% more wages and salaries. So not only were they hiring more people, but they were actually paying them more. All right? And that goes along with increased productivity. Across the board, the companies that we work with had revenue increase and sales increase. And so when we work with companies, that's what counts. Are they hiring more people? Are they more productive? Are they more prosperous? We all care about that. Especially you care about it because you want jobs that are good. So here's the problem we're trying to solve, and this is where I'll finish. So this is why we need to work harder at this. Canada spends a lot of money on higher education, research and development. We're actually ahead of the OECD as a fraction of GDP, and we're way ahead of the US. That may surprise you, that we actually, as a fraction of GDP, Canada spends more money on higher education, research and development than the Americans do. The Americans concentrated at fewer universities, but we spend more as a fraction of GDP. We spend more than OECD, all right? So we have very strong, and you all know this, you're at a strong research university. University research in Canada is very good. And the argument used to be, and it's not an argument that appeals so much to government anymore, if we have strong university research, we'll have a prosperous country. Well, the bar graph shows that that model hasn't worked. In 1980, so on the left-hand side, the dark gray bar is Canada. And this is GDP per capita, which is, you know, what puts money into your wallets. GDP per capita in Canada was higher than the OECD countries, the advanced economies, and it was just slightly below the American. Now, exchange rate factors into this, all those things, but nonetheless, GDP per capita in American dollars was the same, Canada and the US. Year 2000, when the government started investing heavily in research, you can see that we'd slipped with respect to the Americans, and a lot of that was an exchange rate difference. However, we'd also slipped with respect to OECD countries. We were no longer ahead of them. We were now slightly behind. Current year, well, this is 2022 numbers, we're now way behind the Americans and significantly behind OECD countries. So GDP per capita, which is what pays salaries, is declining in Canada right now. Okay? So that's important. On the other hand, university research, my advisor at Toronto, when I was a young professor in the 1990s, declared in the Globe and Mail, I think it was, the authority in Canada, that he was not going to advise any of his students to seek an academic job in Canada because the research situation in Canada was so bad that they should just go abroad. All right? That changed in the late 90s, and especially by 2000, the government started pumping a lot of money into university research. And that support, although it's declined slightly with inflation, is actually still strong. So we've had strong support for university research for more than 2 decades, and yet our prosperity is not increasing. The bar graph down at the bottom here is when governments want to praise themselves, they quote total GDP, which does increase. But it increases in Canada because of inflation and population growth. Canadians actually have been working more hours, and there's more of them. And so that's what's kept the GDP looking okay in terms of growth. However, the productivity, the labor productivity, which is ultimately what drives prosperity, has been in decline for a number of years. So this is serious. And now, the most recent Stats Can data shows that even GDP per capita is declining in Canada. So this is serious. And so we need more people, frankly, with PhDs and with master's degrees and research experience to promote innovation in this country outside of academia. So that's what we're trying to do. But it's critical that all of you think about doing that to the extent that you can. Because it's, our future depends on it. And there's possible explanations. The one that the government is a little bit obsessed with is the curve on the right, which is business expenditures on research and development, which have been in a steady decline since the year 2000. And that hasn't turned around. Now, year 2000 is when Nortel went away, so that was a cause of a big drop in business expenditures. But since then, it's gone down, all right? And there's loads of reasons for this. There's been infinite numbers of reports written on it. But it's the structure of our economy. It's the fact that the large enterprises are typically in protected industries, banking, telecom, transportation. And so there's not much competition, so there's not much need to innovate. And then the rest of the economy, and where we really have to focus our attention, is in small and medium enterprises. We have a much higher fraction of the private sector workforce working in small and medium enterprises than the Americans, for example, or the Koreans, or the Japanese. And so I think with that, hopefully I haven't depressed you, but I think these are, this is the reality. So I've given you some advice. I've told you the luck that I had, which allowed me to be successful. And I've encouraged you all to think about doing internships at MindHacks, because it's a pathway to a more prosperous future and a more interesting future for you if you're not going to become a professor.